Okay, so today we are diving into something pretty intense. You guys asked us to explore the nature of violence, and this source, Cain versus ARES, the battle you never knew existed, takes us right back to the beginning.
Yeah, it's a fascinating approach, using this fictional encounter to explore these deeper truths about violence and its impact.
Exactly, and we all know the story of Cain, right? The first murderer marked by his crime. But this source reframes him, not just as a biblical figure, but as a representation of that primal anger that I think we all kind of have within us.
Yeah, and the setting of this piece, this desolate wasteland, it's not just an empty backdrop. It really reflects the internal states of both Cain and Ares, emphasizing the profound weight of their encounter.
You feel the isolation, like the world itself is holding its breath as these two figures are about to collide. And speaking of Cain, I think we often kind of simplify him to just the bad guy. But this source digs into his inner turmoil. And it's so much more complex than just jealousy.
Oh, absolutely. You see this deep-seated need for validation, the longing for his father's love, even God's approval. And these are desires that I think resonate with the human experience, don't you think?
Absolutely.
Oh.
I mean, who hasn't craved that feeling of being seen and valued? And it's in that space of vulnerability that this source really got to me.
There's a line that stuck out to me. I killed because I was forgotten. It's chilling because it suddenly makes Cain relatable.
It really does. It transforms him from a monster into a human being driven to this desperate act by this profound emotional pain. And that's what makes his confrontation with Ares even more compelling, because in walks Ares the embodiment of reveling in violence.
He's not just a god, he's war personified. He represents that part of us that glorifies violence, that finds a strange allure in conflict and conquest.
And it is interesting how we have these pantheons of war gods across different cultures. It's like violence has always had this strange fascination for humanity.
And yet, even Ares, the god of war, is completely intrigued by Cain's motive. Think about it. Ares is used to people fighting for land, for power, for glory.
The classic motivations.
Right. But here comes Cain, fueled by something far more primal, far more emotional.
So it throws Ares off balance completely. It disrupts his whole worldview.
And that's where things get really fascinating, because the source suggests that this kind of violence, the kind born from emotional wounds, may be the most dangerous kind of all.
It's like the source is saying to us, look, we understand the violence of armies. We understand the violence of empires.
Right.
But what about the violence that simmers beneath the surface, driven by these very primal, very human needs?
And that's the heart of this clash between Cain and Ares, because it's not just a physical fight.
Right.
It's a battle of ideologies. It's a collision of how they view violence itself.
And their views are so different.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Ares sees violence as a tool, something to be mastered and wielded for strategic advantage. He's intrigued by the art of war, by that calculated dance of power.
But Cain is living with the consequences of violence. He's carrying the weight of his actions, the knowledge that he cannot undo what has been done.
And that's why their dialogue is so powerful in this. You see Ares trying to shame Cain, calling him weak for his remorse.
Right.
But Cain flips the script, and he argues that he understands the true cost of violence in a way that Ares never could.
It's almost like he's saying, you may be the god of war, but you haven't truly lived with the consequences of taking a life.
Right. And there's this one moment in the source that I keep coming back to. Cain, overwhelmed, backed into a corner, picks up a stone and hurls it at Ares.
This desperate act.
Yes, but it's also incredibly significant because even Ares, the god of war, seems taken aback by that raw ferocity in Cain's attack.
So what is the source telling us here? That even someone who is defined by an act of violence can still be driven to further violence?
I think it's more nuanced than that. I think it's about how deeply ingrained violence is in the human story. Cain, the victim turned perpetrator, embodies that tragic cycle.
And that cycle continues to play out time and time again throughout history.
Absolutely. And it forces us to confront those uncomfortable questions. What pushes individuals or even entire societies to the brink? And what happens when the only language we understand is the language of violence?
So we're talking about a huge EE shift here, right? Cain, burdened by guilt, marked by violence, chooses to stop fighting.
And it's not about weakness. The source makes it very clear that Cain could keep on fighting if he wanted to. What changes is his understanding.
He looks at Ares, this embodiment of war and glory, and realizes it's all kind of meaningless in the face of what he's learned.
Yeah, this is a really important point. It's easy to kind of read this as a simple good versus evil story, but it's so much deeper than that. Cain isn't rejecting Ares. He's rejecting this worldview that says that violence is the only answer.
Which, let's be honest, is a worldview that's still very much alive today.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Think about how often violence is presented as the solution in our entertainment, our politics, even in our personal lives. I think this source is really challenging us to question that.
And what's fascinating is that Cain's choice, his refusal to engage in violence, becomes its own form of power.
Yeah.
It's like he's saying, look, I've seen the depths of violence, I've lived with its consequences, and I choose something different.
And that choice, that conscious turning away from this cycle of aggression, that's where the true victory lies. The source seems to argue that it's in those quiet acts of defiance, those moments where we resist the urge to meet violence with violence. That's where we find a different kind of strength.
So where does this deep dive leave us? We started with this question of the nature of violence, and we've uncovered something kind of profound.
We've seen how deeply intertwined violence is with the human experience, from our most primal instincts to the systems that we build.
Right.
But we've also seen this possibility of choosing differently, of breaking free from those cycles of aggression.
And maybe that's the most hopeful message of all. If Cain, the first murderer, can choose a path of nonviolence, what does that say about our own potential for change?
Yeah, it's a question worth wrestling with, because ultimately, this story isn't just about Cain and ARES. It's about the choices that we make every day. It's about recognizing the violence within ourselves and in the world around us and asking, what if there's a different way?
And that, I think, is a pretty incredible thought to leave us with. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.
Yeah.
Until next time, keep asking those big questions.